Hello, world history, and welcome back. This is part two of a lecture on the Protestant Reformation. In this part, we are going to talk about some of the political ramifications of the Protestant Reformation. We already started talking about that when we talked about what takes place in England with King Henry VIII and the political motivations for him, well, the personal motivations, which leads to a political change in England. Um, as far as the church goes, right? So someone like Luther and someone like Calvin, they find some government assistance and protection. Luther hiding with princes, and the princes are able to do that in the Holy Roman Empire because it's a loose confederation of princes. But it does lead to conflict between the princes, the Catholic princes versus the Protestant princes, and those protecting Luther. So there is no, although there's local governments that accept um, Lutheranism, it is not a large government doing that over a large area, and it is contested in Germany, right? And we got to remember the monarchy, the government, in this case the kingdoms in Europe, like in a France or a Spain, they, part of their job as the king is to uphold the Catholic Church, right? If we think back to Charlemagne, Charlemagne decided that his kingdom, his monarchy, his kingship is based partly on the fact that God has anointed him king through the Pope. If we think back all the way back to Charlemagne, right? And that idea persists in Europe. And so if the government is not protecting, upholding, and enforcing the Catholic Church, right, and going after heretics and those who challenge the authority of the church, then in a sense they are not doing their job. And so um, England is the first one to do that, and so it's a very big deal when England decides to break from the church, because here is a king and the whole country doing that, right? Catholics who were in England, some of them said to themselves, well, now I'm going to hell because I'm part of a kingdom. I am under the rule of a king who is no longer a Catholic. Um, and so this creates some real problems. But going back to my point, Luther and Calvin, they don't have those large government support. Calvin is just able to basically carve out a little utopia city that he's in control of, and that's it in Switzerland. And that's because Switzerland, right, that's how things were structured in Switzerland. And like I said, Luther is able to get some princes to protect him. But again, not a lot. Now on our map, we say, well, it spreads at some other areas, and it does, Lutheranism, and Lutheranism eventually becomes the official religion in those areas in northern Germany, Sweden, etc. The other group we looked at were the Anabaptists. And again, remember, we said one of the key features of Anabaptists is that they secluded themselves from the rest of society. And so again, they don't have a large government, right, supporting their religious beliefs. In fact, they tend to be persecuted a lot because they secluded themselves. So we have some political ramifications that we talked about last time. Now we're going to talk about some of those conflicts, because when we have these large, as these groups grow, as these Protestant groups grow, they're going to come into conflict with Catholic groups. And so we have Catholic versus Protestant, and even sometimes Protestant versus Protestant conflicts. And that's where we're going, at least to start with in our lecture. So let's look at this, right? So the Protestant Reformation leads to some religious conflicts. Between 1562 and 1598, we have a wide range of conflicts, and usually we think of this as the religious wars of Europe from 1562 to 1598. And these ones in particular seem to be centered, are centered in France. The French Protestants, called Huguenots, are a minority, but they are a significant minority. Remember, minority means it's less than 50%. But you could be like 45%, and that's a lot, right? You could also be a minority and only be like 2% of the population. But the Huguenots are a large minority, a significant minority. And the fact that they're Protestants, the fact that they actually, some of them are quite powerful, right? And in France, this leads to violence, to conflict. And so this is obviously not one long 30-year-long war, but it is, right? It is a sequence of violent conflicts between Catholics and Protestants in France. In fact, in one day in 1572, we have about 3,000 Huguenots massacred by Catholic mob, and we see an illustration of that from 1572, Massacre of the Huguenots. This violence ends when King Henry IV of France issues the Edict of Nantes. This granted religious toleration to the French Protestants, to the Huguenots. It officially recognizes that the Huguenots can be citizens, that they are protected by the same laws that protect French Catholics in France. He argues, because he has to convince, right? Obviously, he's the king, and so people, on the one hand, say, well, he's the king, whatever he says is the rule, but he also has to convince people to believe that it's a good idea. And so his main argument for this, and those who supported the Edict of Nantes, is that soon, right, they will return to the Catholic Church, because this has happened in the Catholic Church before. Splinter groups have gone off, and either they'd kind of just petered out, died out on their own, or they had eventually come back to the church. And so Henry and those who are in support of this Edict of Nantes say, you know what, if we just let them live, they are French brothers and sisters, our cousins and so on. If we just let them live, show them the higher road, eventually they'll return to the one true church, the Catholic Church. And so the Edict of Nantes ends this violence in France between Catholics and Protestants, and in France, those Protestants are called Huguenots. There are some other wars. In the early 1600s, we have a 30-year war, what we call the 30 Years' War, between Catholics and Protestants again. This breaks out in the Holy Roman Empire, right? This area where we have a variety of princes that form the Holy Roman Empire. And some of them are Catholic and some of them are Protestant, primarily Lutheran. This is an extremely destructive war in the Holy Roman Empire. And it spreads to most of Europe and is fairly destructive throughout Europe. About 15 to 30% of the German population die from the violence or the famine and disease that always follow war, right? War is terrible, and famine and disease almost always pop up where there is lots of war. This conflict, the 30 Years' War, ends with the Peace of Westphalia, and this redraws some European political boundaries. And those political boundaries are basically redrawn so that all the Protestants are in a Protestant territory, nation, and Catholics are in Catholic territories or nations, because this is part of the problem with the Holy Roman Empire. It's split, right? The Holy Roman Emperor is supposed to uphold Catholicism, but half of his princes, approximately half, is not quite half, but approximately half of his princes are Protestants, and about half, and by this time, the early 1600s, almost half of his population, like in France, are Protestants. So how can he be the Catholic Holy Roman Emperor and rule over Protestants, right? There's lots of pressure from Catholics, from the Roman Catholic Church, for him to force the Protestants to be Catholics. And of course, that's what this resistance is and why this leads to war. Of course, there are other reasons. There are some economic reasons. There's personal, political reasons, right? Individuals saying, this is a good time for me to exert some more power and control. Why should I be just a prince when I can be the king of my own little kingdom and be independent? These types of things come into play as well. So this Peace of Westphalia, which is a peace in which almost all the European nations participate in, England, Spain, France, the Holy Roman Empire, Sweden, etc., they're all participating in this. It redraws some of the political boundaries. And it says that each state is independent and can control its own religious affairs. So it's saying, basically, particularly in the Holy Roman Empire, but it's saying that like a place like England, if they are going to be Protestant, then they're independent and they can control their own religious affairs. Another nation like a Spain can't just step in and say, oh, hey, you're not Catholic, so we're going to come and invade you. This is important because Spain had tried to do that when we Spain had tried to do that in England with Elizabeth, Queen Elizabeth I. They had attempted to invade England because they had crowned Elizabeth illegitimate. Spain believed that, the Spanish king believed that one of his grandchildren through Catherine, or otherwise, not through Catherine, sorry, Catherine's daughter Mary had died, but other relatives should be placed on the crown. And more importantly, England needed to be returned to the Catholic faith, and that could be accomplished by invading. Of course, that force never really arrives intact, and so Elizabeth and the English are able to defeat a much more powerful force, the Spanish Armada, because it's blown off course in the Channel, and they kind of just trickle in, and the English are able to deal with that. But that's the thinking, and that's what part of this Peace of Westphalia addresses. Other states can't tell another state what to do in regards to religion. So one response of Catholics is violence, and we see two examples of that, right? The violence in France between the Catholics and the Huguenots, and then the 30 Years' War across Europe. The other response of Catholics is, some of them say, hey, maybe Luther and these other reformers they're onto something. Maybe we could make the church better. Maybe the church really is fat and lazy and sinful and immoral. Their leaders are, and we need to change the church. We need to make some changes to the church because we are not as we should be. Pope Paul III is a pope who is open to this, right? And this is in the last half of the 1500s. So like the 30 Years' War still taking place. This doesn't stop the violence, but this is another response to the Protestant Reformation violence, and then a counter-Reformation within the Catholic Church. So to win back followers, Pope Paul says, yes, maybe we should make some changes. There are some things, there are some good points, some good critiques about the Catholic Church. Let's address those. Win back the followers, stop the growth of the Protestant faith. Again, from the Catholic point of view, Christ established a single church, right? And there should be a single church. That's the theological position. And then, of course, there's the political and economic position. They're rich and they're powerful, and if things break apart, they're no longer going to be rich and powerful. So in 1545, Pope Paul III calls for the First Council of Trent, and there are a sequence, or really it's one long council, but it's a sequence of councils that deal with changing the Catholic Church. Some things that this Council of Trent addresses. They reaffirm Catholic teachings and practices. So certain things like salvation, how salvation works, is reaffirmed. Luther is not correct. It's not by grace alone. There is other parts to salvation. They reaffirm that. But they do say, you know what, Luther and others are correct. Some of our priests, some of our bishops, some of our archbishops have been abusing their power, abusing their wealth, and these things need to stop. Things like selling of indulgences, selling church positions, these need to stop. And so they passed internal laws within the church, rules to put a stop to that. And the other thing that they did is they addressed the idea, the challenge, that the clergy were poorly educated. They didn't really know what they're talking about. And so when they get up to preach in the local parish, right, if you go to the little church out in the middle of the forest, in the Black Forest in, let's say, Germany, right, that priest probably has no better education than most of the peasants there anyways. So there is a renewed effort on educating the clergy and making them better educated. If everyone's going to be a scholar of the Bible, then our scholars of the Bible are priests. Let me say that again. If in Protestantism, everyone is a scholar of the Bible and an interpreter of the Bible, and we're not going to go with that, the Catholic Church says, then we at least need to make sure that our priests are better educated and true scholars of the Bible. And so they create a variety of schools and school systems to better educate their clergy, and we'll see how that plays out in a little bit here. Christianity also during this time begins to look outward. So with European explorers, traders, and colonial settlers starting to spread across the globe, right? We've seen that going down the African coast, looking into Asia. The Portuguese saying, hey, if we're going to trade with Asia, we need places for our ships to stop and restock to right on the trip. Um, Spain ending up in the Americas. All these Europeans take their faith with them. Settlers, right, and the explorers and the traders, they all bring their version of faith. And so it could be a version of Protestantism or it could be Roman Catholicism, and they bring it with them and they try to replicate it in some form in their new homelands. So for example here, right, the one we may be most familiar with in the United States, Puritans, those are the Protestants in England again who feel that Queen Elizabeth has not taken the church far enough away from Roman Catholicism, right? They want to purify her church, and so they call themselves Puritans. They find themselves being persecuted because they want to take it too far, and Queen Elizabeth says, no, we need to stay in the middle, and they don't accept that. They push, and eventually they start to challenge her authority, and she has to take action against Puritans in England. So some of them decide, hey, if we can't stay in England, if our freedoms to worship as we believe is the correct way to worship and live our lives as Christians is not being allowed to take place in England, let's get out of England and let's go form a new society of Christianity. And so these are our New England Puritans, our pilgrims, as sometimes we call them, who land in what is now Massachusetts, right up at Plymouth Rock, and eventually they established the Plymouth Colony and then later Massachusetts. They bring with them particular emphasis, education, moral purity, personal conversion, civic responsibility, and they also bring little tolerance for other faiths. So although they want tolerance for their faith, they don't necessarily tolerate other faiths, other versions of Protestant Christianity like Lutherans, nor do the Puritans, and in general most of these other groups tolerate other religious or other more diverse religious groups such as Roman Catholics or even some other non-Christian religions like Islam. The most successful groups that spread in Christianity end up being missionaries, and primarily are Catholic missionaries. Catholic missionaries are the most successful. Right? I had mentioned just a little while ago that one of the reforms of the Catholic Church is to better educate their clergy, and there are some orders that are either created or significantly changed because of this. And the primary orders that end up in missionary work that are well educated are the Dominicans, the Franciscans, and the Jesuits. And I'm going to talk about the Jesuits just real quick because they are the example of probably the best educated of the groups. The Jesuits took it upon themselves as missionaries that before they would go to a foreign area to be a missionary, they would learn the customs and the language of that group they were going to. So for instance, in U.S. history, right, in the history of the United States and Canada, French Jesuits who end up in what's today Canada, the French colonies in what's today Canada, right, they would study Native American languages and customs. And so when they arrived, they could already speak that language. They already knew the basic customs, how that society worked, and so they could fit right in. It wasn't like they were bringing something foreign to Native Americans, and Native Americans, of course, presented something foreign to them, and they just didn't understand each other. No, the Jesuits took time to understand the group they were going to, learn their language, learn their customs, learn how their society worked as best as they could, and then they were humble. And usually they would spend the first year or two just living. They wouldn't even push. Of course, they would pray themselves and stuff, but they wouldn't push for conversions. They just lived their lives and observed. And eventually then, once they did that, then they would start to introduce some of their teachings to the group. They would start saying, hey, you know what? You worship right? You worship like the great creator spirit. Well, let me tell you about God and Jesus. I think they may be the same. And they would take that approach. They were probably the best at doing that. Dominicans and Franciscans did that to a degree as well, but not as good as the Jesuits. And that's because the Jesuits spent a lot of time, again, in education. And this education of the language usually took place in Europe, right? So Jesuit colleges in Europe would offer these different languages and courses in these different cultures. In general, the Portuguese missionaries went to Africa and Asia and spread Christianity there. Again, this is going to be Catholicism. Spanish and French missionaries spread Christianity to the Americas. The French in what is today Canada, and the Spanish in basically Mexico South. And we also have, though, this is not limited to just Roman Catholic Church or to the Protestant denominations. We also have, for instance, Russian missionaries spreading Eastern Orthodox Christianity throughout the Russian Empire. And this, of course, the Russian Empire is spreading east into Asia, right? The steppes that we've been talking about, like where the Mongolians would live, they were spreading Christianity that way. And just as a side note, here in California, some Russian missionaries made it to California. They didn't leave a lasting impact on California, but they did make it, and we have some evidence of them being here. Of the Catholic missionaries, the most successful are the Spanish in the Americas. And in the Philippines, sorry. So the Spanish in both the Americas and the Philippines. Why are they the most successful here? Well, because both of these areas were fully colonized by Spain, right? Unlike perhaps the Portuguese, who just basically try to control a port city, Spain ends up controlling large areas. Again, if we think about Spain's control in the Americas, they controlled everything from actually California and Arizona, New Mexico and Texas, all the way south to the bottom of the South American continent, with the exception of Brazil, which was Portuguese, and of course a couple small areas that were French and English. But they controlled all that. They weren't looking to control just a couple cities, they were controlling the whole area, and they do the same in the Philippines. So fully colonized by Spain, complete control. A lot of Europeans move to these Spanish colonies, and they end up living there. And so these Christians, who are not necessarily missionaries, although certainly missionaries start right out in those areas, but as Spain fully colonizes the Americas, the Spanish America, and the Philippines, they have a fairly large number of colonizers, of Europeans moving there, who bring and practice the faith with them. And these two places, the Philippines and the Americas, lack a literate, well-established world religion. They have their local religions, and they do have some limited written language in some of these areas, but it's not like with Islam. It's not like Arabic, which is well-established, printing presses and so on. It's not like Buddhism, again, well-established. These are well-established in their local communities, but it's not a universal religion. Remember, we talked about what a universal religion is: a religion that is open to anyone. It's not tied to your tribe, your family, your ethnicity. It is a universal religion that anyone participates in. And the viewpoint is, even if you don't believe in it, it still applies to you because it's the reality. So these help Christianity become well established, in particular Catholicism, well established in these two areas. Europeans in Spanish America, so we're talking primarily about the Spanish here, see their political and military success in Spanish America as proof of the power of the Christian God, right? So the large conversion rates, which many of them were forced, but they still consider them conversion rates, right, only reinforces that this has been God's will to spread to these new areas and to bring Christianity with them. This, of course, does create a little bit of conflict in the Americas, as many Native Americans do agree. Either they are coerced, like many are in California, right? They have to, or usually they're severely punished in a variety of ways, or some of them truly accept Christian practices. But probably most Native Americans see the acceptance of Christian practices and beliefs in baptism as a way to kind of avoid being the enemy, being accepted. But but that doesn't mean that they give up everything. They still want to keep a lot of their local gods and traditions as well. And so this creates um, this creates some violence and between locals who have claimed to accept Christianity but don't do everything, right, and European colonizers in the Americas. So frustration with the persistence of old local traditions sometimes leads to violence. For instance, destruction of pagan shrines and idols, right? Native Americans don't want those. Those are long-standing traditions. Why would you do that, right? Destruction of religious images and ritual objects, public urination on native idols, right? Europeans, right? Europeans would urinate on some of these things, as and of course, Native Americans took offense to that. There would be floggings of those that worshiped the idols, or what the Christians called idols, and religious trials and processions of shame to humiliate offenders, right? So if you had prayed to one of these idols, maybe you would be humiliated and you have to walk through town stripped almost naked, confessing your sins or something like that, right? This doesn't lead to a lot of deep down acceptance of Christianity. This actually leads to some resentment. The other thing that happens is Native Americans kind of create a mix of Christianity and their own native beliefs, right? Indigenous beliefs. And we see that particularly in the versions of Christianity in today in like Mexico and in Chile and more Chile or like Peru, where some of the beliefs and styles of worship are a mix of European Christianity and Native American beliefs. So like the Virgin of Guadalupe, right, is kind of this version of the Mother Mary, the Virgin Mary. But it's also, right, but it's also an important tie to Aztec and other Mexican beliefs, traditional beliefs. So it's not a copy, right? It's a blend. It's actually a new version of Christianity. So Catholic saints become important in Mexican Christianity, paralleling the function of pre-colonial gods, right? All the various gods in pre-European Mexico, pre-contact. There's a variety of gods, and so many of these saints, which are already in the church, kind of take on the roles for Native Americans that their old gods did. All right, we're going to stop there for this lecture. So today, we're just going to stop there with the Americas. We're going to pick up Christianity in Asia next time. So have a great weekend or day, and we will see you next time.